September 12, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The air was heavy with humidity, thick with the smell of earth and sweat. As the sun dipped below the jungle canopy, the sound of insects grew louder, echoing through the dark green valleys. On a narrow, uneven ridge south of Henderson Field, a few hundred U.S. Marines were digging in, their shovels scraping volcanic soil, their eyes glancing nervously toward the black jungle ahead. They didn't know it yet, but within hours they would be facing one of the most ferocious assaults of the Pacific War. The ridge was nameless then, just a rise in the jungle roughly 400 feet high, running east to west with steep drops on both sides. Later, the world would know it as Edson's Ridge, after the man who led the defense, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red Mike" Edson, commander of the Marine Raiders. Guadalcanal itself had become a nightmare. The Marines had landed a month earlier, on August 7, 1942, the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War. Their mission was simple: capture and hold a half-finished Japanese airstrip on the island's north coast. They did it. They renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. But since then, nothing about Guadalcanal had been simple. By early September, the Marines were exhausted. Malaria spread through the ranks. Food was short. Japanese aircraft bombed them almost daily, and warships shelled them at night. Supplies trickled in only occasionally. Some Marines joked that C rations stood for constantly running out. Many were down to one meal a day, a mix of rice, Spam, and whatever could be scavenged from abandoned Japanese supplies. But worst of all, the Japanese were regrouping. General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, had been ordered to retake Guadalcanal at any cost. He dispatched Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi with nearly 3,000 elite troops, veterans from Malaya, Borneo, and the Philippines. They were the finest the Imperial Japanese Army had left in the South Pacific. Their mission? Infiltrate through the jungle and crush the thin Marine perimeter around Henderson Field in one swift, decisive night attack. Kawaguchi's plan was bold and brutal. His forces would strike from three directions, converging on the airfield like a tightening noose. But the main assault, the killing blow, would fall along the narrow ridge held by Edson's Raiders. Edson's Raiders were no ordinary Marines. They were hand-picked men, trained for commando-style raids and jungle warfare. They'd fought on Tulagi and Gavutu, small islands near Guadalcanal, taking heavy casualties in brutal close-quarters battles. Now they numbered only about 800. Alongside them were about 250 men from the 1st Parachute Battalion, survivors of earlier operations. Together, they formed a ragged, understrength battalion, about 1,000 men in total. On the evening of September 12th, Edson knew the Japanese were coming. Recon patrols had reported movement in the jungle, and a captured map hinted at a large attack force approaching from the south. But he didn't know when or from where the strike would fall. The Marines were stretched thin, holding a front nearly 2 miles long. As dusk deepened, Edson walked along the ridge, checking each foxhole, speaking quietly to his men. His voice carried calm authority. "He'll come tonight, boys. Keep your heads down, keep your fire low, and when you see them, make it count." At 9 p.m., the first contact came. From the darkness beyond the ridge came the sharp cracks of Japanese rifles and the unmistakable cry of "Banzai!" The Marines froze, eyes scanning the tree line. Then the jungle exploded. Mortar shells began falling along the ridge, sending shards of metal and dirt raining over the Marines' shallow trenches. Flares popped overhead, bathing the hillside in an eerie green light. Shadows flickered and danced. From the jungle below came the clatter of machine guns and the shouts of hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging uphill. The Marines opened fire, Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and M1 Garands lighting the night in bursts of flame. The first wave of attackers fell quickly, but more came right behind them, stepping over the bodies of their comrades. The fighting was savage. In places, the Japanese broke through the outer line, forcing the Marines into hand-to-hand combat. Raiders used bayonets, knives, even entrenching tools to fight off the attackers. Edson moved up and down the line, calmly directing fire, shouting orders through the chaos. "Hold your fire until you see them," he yelled. "Make every shot count." For hours, the battle raged. The Japanese attacked again and again, each time shouting, charging, and dying on the slopes below the ridge. By midnight, the air was thick with gun smoke and the smell of blood. The Marines' ammunition was running low. Radio messages crackled through the command post. "We're being overrun. We need support." Edson ordered a controlled withdrawal, just 200 yards north to a tighter defensive line near the ridge's crest. The men fell back in small groups, dragging wounded comrades, setting up new firing positions under the moonlight. Behind them, the lower slopes were littered with bodies, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lying where they'd fallen. That morning, Edson walked among the trenches, his face streaked with dirt and smoke. He told his officers, "They'll come again tonight, and they'll come harder." He was right. The first night had only been the beginning. At 2 a.m., the second wave hit. This time, it was even worse. The Japanese had regrouped and attacked in massed formations, screaming as they charged through the jungle. Some crawled forward under machine gun fire, hurling grenades into foxholes. A mortar shell exploded near Edson's command post, blowing men off their feet. Shrapnel tore through tents, maps, and radio sets. But the Marines held. Captain Kenneth Bailey, commanding Company C, fought like a man possessed. Wounded in the head by shrapnel, he refused evacuation, leading his men in counterattacks that sealed several dangerous gaps in the line. Nearby, Sergeant Red Whaling used a captured Japanese light machine gun to mow down attackers until the barrel glowed red-hot. At dawn, the surviving Japanese pulled back. The ridge was quiet, except for the moans of the wounded and the buzzing of flies. The Marines had held. Barely. Their losses were heavy. Dozens killed, many more wounded. But the jungle below was carpeted with enemy dead. That morning, Edson walked among the trenches, his face streaked with dirt and smoke. "They'll come again tonight," he told his officers, "and they'll come harder." He was right. The first night had only been the beginning. 2 nights of hell. September 13th, 1942, the second night. The ridge was quiet in the afternoon, but it was the kind of quiet that made men uneasy, the kind that felt alive, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. All day long the Marines worked frantically to strengthen their defenses. They dragged ammunition crates, repositioned machine guns, and dug deeper foxholes in the stony soil. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly, and the men were soaked in sweat. Flies buzzed thick around the bodies that still littered the lower slopes, hundreds of Japanese soldiers who had fallen in the previous night's attack. The smell of death hung heavy in the humid air. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson didn't rest. He moved constantly from one position to another, studying the terrain, conferring with his officers, and reassuring the men. His uniform was caked in dirt and sweat, but his mind was razor-sharp. He knew what was coming. Recon patrols had reported new Japanese movements in the jungle. The survivors from the previous night weren't retreating, they were regrouping. At his command post near the ridge's crest, Edson spoke quietly with his artillery observer. "Tell the 11th Marines we'll need illumination shells at 1900 hours, and make sure we've got fire support on both flanks. They'll come at us again, right up this damn hill." The men called it Bloody Ridge now. No one needed to ask why. The build-up to the storm. Down in the jungle below, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was furious. His first assault had failed, and his troops, the elite of the Japanese army, had been shredded by the marine defense. But retreat was not an option. Tokyo demanded victory at all costs. That morning, Kawaguchi gathered what remained of his forces, around 2,000 men, and delivered a fiery speech. "We will take the airfield or die trying. Heaven will not permit failure." The plan was the same: attack the ridge from the south in a massive frontal assault, crush the defenders, and sweep down onto Henderson Field. The Japanese soldiers, weary and hungry, obeyed without hesitation. Many of them had been marching and fighting for days through malaria-infested jungle with little food or water. Yet their discipline held. They cleaned their rifles, fixed bayonets, and waited for darkness. The second night falls. By 6:30 p.m., the sun had vanished behind the western hills. The sky glowed faintly red for a few moments before fading into total darkness. Then the jungle came alive again, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant voices in Japanese. The Marines on the ridge could hear them. Private First Class Harold McGraw, manning a Browning machine gun on the front line, whispered to his buddy, "They're out there, I can smell 'em." His friend nodded. "Yeah, they'll come soon." At exactly 9 p.m., the first Japanese mortars began to fall. Shells burst along the ridge, throwing dirt and shrapnel into the air. The Marines ducked low in their foxholes as fragments whistled overhead. Then came the eerie glow of signal flares, red and green, bursting above the treetops. And then, from the darkness below, came the roar, "Banzai!" Thousands of Japanese soldiers surged up the slope. The Marines opened fire. Machine guns chattered in deadly rhythm. Riflemen squeezed their triggers steadily, counting shots, conserving ammunition. The night lit up with muzzle flashes and tracer rounds. Grenades exploded among the attackers, showering dirt and limbs into the air. For a moment the line held, but the Japanese kept coming, climbing, crawling, leaping over fallen comrades. Some reached the Marine trenches, throwing grenades inside or swinging bayonets wildly. Others tried to infiltrate through the jungle on the flanks, only to be cut down by concentrated fire from supporting units. Captain Kenneth Bailey, already wounded from the previous night, stood on the ridge shouting orders. "Hold your fire, wait until they're close, make every bullet count." His voice rose above the chaos like a drill sergeant's curse. A Japanese grenade exploded near his position, peppering him with shrapnel. He staggered, then raised his Thompson submachine gun and fired into the darkness until the drum emptied. Moments later, he collapsed. Bailey would die the next day from his wounds. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. The break in the line. By midnight, the situation was desperate. The Japanese had punched a hole near the center of the Marine line. Edson immediately moved his reserve, about 40 Marines from Company B, to plug the gap. It was the last group of fresh men he had. Those 40 Marines, exhausted, hungry, and covered in grime, became the thin wall between survival and annihilation. They took position along a small rise just south of the command post, stacking ammunition, setting up machine guns, and preparing for what everyone knew would be the final charge. Then at 2:30 a.m., the third wave hit. It came like a tidal wave. Thousands of Japanese soldiers charged uphill, screaming, bayonets flashing in the moonlight. They came straight at the 40 men holding the center. The Marines fired everything they had, rifles, bars, even captured Japanese weapons. The ground shook with the noise. The muzzle flashes were so constant that men could see each other's faces, pale, grim, and streaked with sweat and soot. When the machine guns overheated, they poured water from their canteens on the barrels and kept firing. When their ammunition ran low, runners dashed through gunfire to bring more boxes up from the rear. One of them, Private William Bourdalogne, made 4 trips through enemy fire before he was hit and killed on the 5th. The battle devolved into chaos. Japanese troops broke through in small groups, leaping into the Marine trenches. The fighting was hand-to-hand, bayonets, knives, rifle butts. One Marine officer later said, "It was like fighting ghosts. They came out of the dark, screaming, and you shot them point blank, or they killed you." Edson himself was everywhere, shouting orders, rallying broken units, and dragging wounded men back into line. At one point, he climbed onto an ammunition crate, silhouetted against the burning jungle, and yelled, "There's nothing behind us, men, just the ocean. Hold this ridge or we'll all be in the sea." The men heard him, and they held. The turning point. At around 3:30 a.m., Marine artillery began firing again, 105mm shells from the 11th Marines pounding the slopes below the ridge. Each blast sent shock waves through the jungle, tearing apart trees and men alike. The artillery fire was so close that shrapnel whined over the Marines' heads, but it stopped the Japanese cold. By dawn, the last wave of attackers was broken. The survivors stumbled back into the jungle, many of them wounded or delirious. On the ridge, the Marines sat in silence, staring at the devastation around them. The slopes were carpeted with bodies, more than 1,200 Japanese dead in front of their positions alone. Out of Edson's 830 men, fewer than 200 were still fit to fight. Many units were down to a handful of soldiers, but they held. The morning after. When the sun rose on September 14th, it revealed a scene from hell. The ridge was torn apart, trees shattered, trenches blown open, the air thick with smoke and the stench of death. Marines moved slowly among the bodies, collecting weapons, checking for survivors, and helping the wounded. Colonel Edson walked the line, silent and expressionless. His men saluted him as he passed. One sergeant, sitting beside his machine gun, said, "Colonel, we held." Edson nodded once. "Yes, we did." Later, as the reports came in, it became clear what had happened. Fewer than 1,000 Marines, many of them wounded, hungry, and exhausted, had stopped an assault by 3,000 of Japan's best soldiers. The victory saved Henderson Field, and with it, the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The ridge that saved Guadalcanal. September 14th, 1942, dawn over Bloody Ridge. When the morning haze lifted from the jungle canopy, Henderson Field lay silent except for the distant buzz of flies. The ridge south of the airstrip looked like a scar on the earth, blackened trees, churned soil, and hundreds of still forms. Smoke drifted lazily from burned palm trunks. Marines moved carefully among the wreckage, rifles slung, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. They were alive. Barely. Out of the roughly 800 men who had held the ridge, fewer than 200 could stand unassisted. Many had not slept in 48 hours. Some had fired their rifles until the barrels glowed red. Others sat in silence, staring at the corpses piled in front of their foxholes. Every few minutes, a shot cracked, a Marine ending the suffering of a wounded enemy who refused surrender. At 0800 hours, Colonel Edson ordered a full sweep of the area. Patrols fanned out through the steaming undergrowth, stepping over discarded helmets and shattered weapons. They found torn maps, blood-stained flags, and journals filled with prayers and farewell notes. Most of the enemy had died where they stood. A few, delirious from blood loss, still clutched grenades and blew themselves apart when approached. When the count was complete, more than 1,200 Japanese soldiers lay dead on and around the ridge. The Marines had lost 94 killed, about 200 wounded. The ratio stunned even seasoned officers. Securing the island. The battle's outcome rippled across Guadalcanal. Henderson Field remained in American hands, and the fragile perimeter around it solidified. For the first time, U.S. commanders could stage fighter and bomber sorties without fear of immediate overrun. Throughout the next week, Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers launched daily to harass Japanese supply convoys, the infamous Tokyo Express, that attempted to reinforce the island under cover of darkness. General Alexander, commanding the 1st Marine Division, visited the ridge the following afternoon. He walked slowly up the slope, past wrecked machine guns and the bodies of Japanese officers. When he reached Edson's command post, a shallow pit lined with empty ammunition boxes, he removed his helmet and said quietly, "Edson, you and your men have done something the world will remember." The two men shook hands. Neither spoke again for several moments. Words were unnecessary. Tokyo's reaction. Far across the Pacific, the Japanese High Command received the news in disbelief. Reports from survivors of Kawaguchi's brigade described unimaginable resistance and enemy firepower beyond estimation. Kawaguchi himself, wounded and humiliated, retreated north through the jungle with only a few hundred men. When he finally reached friendly lines, he filed a brief report stating simply, "Our attack failed completely. The enemy fought to the last." At Imperial General Headquarters, staff officers studied the numbers and concluded that the enemy must have possessed at least a full regiment backed by tanks and heavy artillery. They refused to believe that fewer than 1,000 Marines had destroyed an entire Japanese brigade. The shock would shape Japanese tactics for the rest of the campaign. Heavier bombardments, night assaults abandoned in favor of coordinated ground-air operations. Recognition and reflection. In Washington, dispatches from Guadalcanal arrived by coded radio. The details were sparse at first. Enemy attack repelled on ridge south of airfield, heavy casualties inflicted. But as the full scope emerged, correspondents began calling it the most heroic stand of the Pacific War so far. Colonel Edson received the Medal of Honor for his leadership. Captain Kenneth Bailey was awarded the same decoration posthumously. Dozens of Marines earned Navy Crosses and Silver Stars. Yet when interviewed later, many survivors spoke not of medals, but of exhaustion and disbelief. "We just did what we were trained to do," one corporal said. "We didn't have anywhere to run." Medical officers noted the toll: malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, and psychological trauma. Men who had stared down charging bayonets now trembled at sudden noises. Chaplains held brief burial services each evening, reading from damp prayer books as rain drummed on ponchos stretched over the graves. Strategic consequences. Historians later identified the defense of Edson's Ridge as the turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign. Had the ridge fallen, Japanese troops would have captured Henderson Field, denying the U.S. control of the skies and forcing evacuation of the island. Instead, the victory gave American commanders a foothold in the Solomons, from which they could push north towards Rabaul and eventually the Philippines. The engagement also demonstrated that well-led infantry, properly dug in and supported by precise artillery, could withstand numerically superior Japanese forces. It broke the myth of invincibility that had followed Japan's army since 1937. Intelligence analysts in Pearl Harbor later wrote, "Edson's Ridge proved that disciplined fire and coordination could blunt even the fiercest banzai charge." Life on the ridge after the battle. For the men who remained, the ridge became a strange sanctuary. They named its highest point Edson's Hill and built makeshift shelters among the shell craters. Between patrols, they cleaned their rifles, swapped stories, and buried the dead, friend and foe alike. Marines used empty ration tins to mark graves until proper crosses could be fashioned from palm wood. Rain came every afternoon, washing the blood into the red soil. Vines began to creep back over the torn earth, and within a month the jungle started reclaiming the battlefield. But nothing could erase the memory of those nights. Veterans said they could still hear the screams in their dreams decades later. Legacy. When the 1st Marine Division was finally relieved and withdrawn from Guadalcanal in December 1942, the men left behind a simple sign at the base of the ridge. "You are now entering Edson's Ridge, held by Marines, September 12-14. For the Marine Corps, the defense became a legend, studied in every officer's school as the textbook example of small unit endurance under overwhelming attack. Future generations of Marines learned the same lesson. Edson had shouted amid the gunfire, "There is nothing behind you but the sea. Hold the line." Decades later, historians would describe the stand as the moment when the United States began to reverse the tide in the Pacific. The courage of a few hundred men on a nameless hill had changed the course of a world war. Epilogue. Today, the ridge still rises quietly above the grasslands of Guadalcanal. The jungle has grown thick again, but the scars remain. Rusted helmets half buried in the soil, twisted metal fragments glinting in the sun. A memorial stone stands near the crest, engraved with a single inscription: "In memory of the officers and men who fought and died here, September 1942. Their valor saved an airfield, and with it the Pacific." Visitors who stand there on a humid afternoon can look down toward the modern airstrip, still called Henderson Field, and imagine the night when 40 exhausted Marines faced 3,000 determined enemies and refused to yield.